Gremlins! It's been a while since I've redrawn some of my old art, but in honor of Halloween, here's a drawing of 2 witches on a broomstick. I created it 4 years ago when I was 17 and drawing a lot of art of girls being in love for some reason. I was in the closet and didn't have another outlet. Overall, it isn't a bad drawing, but I've definitely improved my compositions, anatomy, and line work since I've created it, so this will be fun to improve. As I redrew an image involving a broomstick only a couple months ago when I was creating frog-themed Halloween stickers, still available on my Etsy by the way, check them out, I already knew that I wanted to start by turning a broom viewed from the boring side-on angle to a broom pointing slightly toward the viewer. When I had the broomstick base, I started figuring out the poses of the witches perched on top of it. While I am changing the angle of the scene, I'm not changing the pose much. In both the original and the redrawn art, the shorter witch is resting her head on the taller witch's shoulder, their hands clasped between them. I did end up changing the actual silhouettes of the witches though, making the taller witch more curvy. By the way, my next video will be posted not long after the 3rd anniversary of this channel, and as part of it, I'm hoping to do a small Q&A. So please, if you have any questions for me about me, my art, or random characters I've created, ask them in the comments. I'll be making a community post about this as well, and posting on my Instagram, which is linked in the description of every video. Thanks, and back to these witches in love. When I had a rough sketch, I began a second, more detailed sketch layer to figure out the more precise poses, as well as the clothing and faces. These witches aren't just random one-off characters, by the way. They do have names, which I'll use to refer to them for the rest of the video, so I can stop saying the taller witch and the shorter witch. The shorter witch is Hazel Quickthorn, one of my many self-insert OCs. In this case, an OC created for a daydream about living in a forest of spooky beings. The taller witch is Hazel's girlfriend, Celeste. Around age 16 or 17, I started giving a lot of my OCs girlfriends instead of the boyfriends I'd always had before, all part of figuring myself out. I have talked about Hazel before, but it was one of my very early videos on the channel, and therefore not good quality. You're welcome to look it up, but I will not be rewatching it, and I'm not sure if any of Hazel's lore has shifted in the last few years since I made it. It is a daydream world after all, and while I may not enter this particular daydream often anymore, it is still fluid. This is the part of the sketch where I started getting really frustrated. I just could not figure out how to draw these 2 witches holding hands. Between the fact that hands are already really tricky, the angle of the drawing, and the positions the rest of the bodies were in, these hands were just evading every attempt to sketch them. I did try to ignore them for a while and work on the rest of the sketch, but I just kept coming back to them. I finally figured out something where, instead of resting on one of the witch's legs, the hands are raised between them, and that seemed to work, although it does look like Hazel and Celeste are gripping each other in worry. With the hands finally wrangled, I started sketching the clothes and ran into my next hurdle, which luckily I passed with much less struggle. In the original image, Hazel is wearing a full-length skirt with her legs crossed so that one ankle is resting on her thigh. When I drew this the first time, I did not know how to draw skirts in this position, and I just winged it, badly. Now, I want to avoid that, but after a cursory attempt at figuring out the fabric drape, I decided to avoid it by just not giving Hazel a full-length skirt. Instead, a dress that splits at the waist and flows out behind her like a cape, and stockings on her legs. These witches don't belong to a certain time period. They're just dressed in a vaguely historical, fantasy way that I drew all witches wearing as a teenager before I got interested in accuracy. I think the best way to explain these clothing choices is that Hazel and Celeste live in the modern era, but choose to dress in a historically inspired way for the witchy vibes. Either that, or the fact that they live in a magical wood populated by vampires, werewolves, ghosts, and zombies means that they follow fashion trends only vaguely parallel to regular human fashion. I changed the clothing choices fairly substantially, but kept mostly the same color palette and vibes. Hazel is a more earth-focused witch, with a focus on herbs and potions and growing things. Celeste is more focused on the sky, on celestial bodies and telling the future in the stars. Therefore, I gave the moon necklace Hazel wore in the old illustration to Celeste, and instead Hazel is wearing a wooden oak leaf pendant. One of the elements of my art that has definitely improved since I drew these women 4 years ago is my line art. I used to use one simple round brush at one thickness for the entire image, and while workable, it was kinda boring. Now though, I use multiple line weights, with a thick outer outline and very thin lines for details like jewelry. I only started experimenting with my line art in the last year and a bit, and I'm still improving. For example, now, rather than constantly adjusting my brush weight as I work, I go through the image with each line weight in entirety, then switch to a thinner one and go back. I start by outlining the whole image in my thickest line. Then I'll outline each individual element, clothing item, hair, silhouette, etc., with a thinner brush. Then I'll go back and do all my detail work with the thinnest brush, still varying the line weight with the pressure I apply. I added more details to Hazel's dress/robe than were in the original design, adding simple twisting vines to the fabric. I also changed the silhouette of Celeste's top to be more Victorian-inspired, with an anachronistic corset worn over top as a belt. I also experimented with something new in this image, drawing blush with a scribbled line. This is a style I see a lot in other art, but haven't used since my very bad anime-style phase in middle school. I like how it turned out, though. I actually drew the original illustration in an airport, and it was a very planned project. I knew that I'd have access to my laptop in the airport while waiting for my flight with my family, but I didn't have cell data or know if I could access the airport Wi-Fi. So, in the days leading up to the trip, I prepared several drawings I could do with just my trackpad, no drawing tablet needed, to keep myself occupied. I drew all the line art of the original illustration ahead of time, but left the coloring for later since I could color within the lines without my stylus. Coloring with a trackpad is frustrating, but at the time I was fairly used to it, as throughout the previous semester of school I'd been finding PNGs of coloring pages online and coloring them with the same method when the school Wi-Fi got turned off at the end of the class day, and I had to spend another 3 or 4 hours on campus as a theater stage crew during dress rehearsals. Each witch has a clear color palette. I really like giving my characters narrow color palettes. Obviously, the character who's inspired by me is wearing all greens, just like I do in real life. Hazel is dressed in green, black, and brown. brown. Meanwhile, Celeste is dressed in blues, greys, and hints of purple. Hazel is dressed like her plants, Celeste like the night sky. I'm keeping the general colours the same as my original image, but tweaked slightly. For instance, the greens I'm using for Hazel are warmer toned than the original, more earthy. Also, since I changed her outfit, her robe is all black with green details rather than a bit of black over a green dress. I was going to compensate by giving her green stockings instead, inspired by the striped stockings that I'm pretty sure originate in Victorian depictions of Halloween witches. However, I ended up recoloring those stockings a few times to figure out how exactly I wanted them to look, and in the end they are brown rather than green. Hazel's green colour palette now mostly comes from her massive curly green hair and the details on her dress and in her crystal jewellery. Her eyes are also green, very pale yellow green. The massive curly green hair and pale red-rimmed eyes are Hazel's oldest character traits, from back in primary school when I first entered my witch phase. Celeste's hair is more naturally coloured, but she does have a streak of blonde at her temple because of her witch heritage. That's inspired by the design of Pulgera the Sorceress from the Belgariad series, as by the time Celeste was added to the Daydream canon, I'd read a lot more books involving witches, magic, sorcery, and the like. Celeste has several jewellery pieces, just like Hazel did. She's wearing a crescent moon necklace that in the original drawing was Hazel's, but thematically fits Celeste better. She also has a necklace of cool-toned crystals and a choker with a blue stone at the centre. I made the perhaps questionable choice of putting all the coloured line art on one layer, so when going over it to match all the internal colours I had to be very precise. Normally when multicoloured lines overlap I'd use different layers, but I guess I didn't for some reason in this project. The rest of Celeste's clothing lines up pretty close to the original. A grey shirt and skirt instead of a grey dress though, and a blue overskirt with a purposely tattered looking edge. I gave her light brown skin and blush to match Hazel's, and finally added another unique feature of hers, heterochromia with one brown eye and one blue eye on the same side as her blonde hair streak. I'm moving away from my previous method of shading toward a more cel-shaded look. I've experimented with it on a few illustrations in the last few months, and I think I actually prefer the look to my previously blended and blurred shading. In this case, I'm adding 2 layers of cel shading, one for the darker shadows and one for the generally more shadowed areas. Sometimes when I use this method, I'll still render the hair and skin fully, but I didn't in this illustration. The shadows in this image are quite dark and cool-toned, since this is a nighttime image. I'm using the same hue of blue as the background circle, but in a multiply layer to make it dark on all the layers below. Cel shading may look simpler than my old blended method, but while it does take one less step, I do have to be a lot more precise. I can't just rough in a shadow and blend it out later. Each shadow needs neat edges and careful placement, and I think the end result is worth the extra care. I don't know, I'm still deciding if I want to switch to this shading method or go back to my old one. I added some shiny highlights to the hair, then turned to the background. I'm keeping the background pretty much the same as my previous version of the illustration. Rather than a realistic background, it is stylized with a circle of starry sky placed behind the characters, and some bat silhouettes overlapping the edges. I'm pretty sure in the original this is just straight up a photograph of the night sky I stole from Google Images, but now I have brushes that can produce a starry sky effect, so this new sky is all drawn by me. I've also been working off-center this whole time to fit my original illustration in the corner without covering any of my current art. However, with the illustration now closer to finished, I'm moving it all to the center of the canvas where it belongs. And I'm done and ready for the reveal. Here is the old version of the illustration. And here is the new version. I'm really happy with the changes. The old version of the illustration was close to the best I could do at the time, and being able to prove it and see how far I've come in the last few years was really satisfying. It's also just always nice to go back to my early queer art and talk about it more freely than I could when I first drew it, and would either hide it from people or hope that they just thought these witches were good friends. In fact, the original name of this piece was Broommates, a pun on the vine, "Oh my god, they were roommates," which is often used to talk about people who are clearly a queer couple, but people think they just happen to live together. Anyway, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this art in the comments, as well as any questions you have for me that I can answer in my next video. Happy Halloween, and until next time, bye!